Cameras are rolling.
Rolling. Sound speeding.
The time has come for our celebration of cinema's classic, Real Monsters!
Hello, everyone. I bid you welcome to episode 4 of Real Monsters Podcast. I'm your host, AJ Danna, and I'm grateful you're tuning in. Thanks for joining me today. Previously on Real Monsters Podcast, I spoke with Becky Laff about her Phantom of the Opera graphic novel, which is still live on Kickstarter. On the topic of graphic novels, we seem to be experiencing something of a classic monster boom in the comic book field. My guest on today's episode is Brian Neiford, an artist and writer presenting his own fresh take on the classic monster lore. If you happen to be both a classic monster fan and a history buff, Monsters: The Forsaken may be the comic series for you. But before we dive into the details, as you might know, I secretly invite each of my Real Monsters podcast guests to start their interview with their best mad scientist laugh, to keep that fun Halloween and horror vibe alive. So, without further ado, please welcome to Real Monsters Podcast, Brian Neiford.
Happy birthday, AJ.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian. Excellent job with your mad scientist laugh, and I really appreciate the well wishes. It is good to have you on the show, Brian.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I have just recently wrapped up reading the first trade paperback of your graphic novel, Monsters: The Forsaken, World War II, Chapter 1. This is a beautifully drawn book. The story is very clever, and I think this is one of the few modern adaptations of the monsters that I've seen that really captures the Gothic aesthetic so well. So bravo to you for that.
Thank you very much. That means a lot to me. You just gave me chills. I really appreciate the fact and love it when people tell me that they've enjoyed the story as well as the art, because I worked very hard on both of them.
Absolutely, and it definitely shows the amount of love and appreciation for the classic stories and also for history that you've packed into this book is really evident. So why don't you tell me a little bit more about the book and how you originally conceived this idea?
I've always loved the classic monsters. And listening to some of your other podcasts, it's clear that you do too. I grew up watching the black and white classic monster movies on Saturday mornings. They were some of my fondest memories as a kid, was watching these and just having that time to really get immersed in these monster movies that were scary at the time, but not over the top with gore. And you could watch them as a kid and be scared by them, but also fascinated, which is what happened to me. And basically, I started drawing at a very young age, and I really wanted to be a comic book artist, but it just didn't kind of go my way. I really didn't know the ins and outs of the business. I wasn't connected to anything. And I went on with my life and had a full-time job. And I'm kind of closing in on the end of my career here. About 10 to 12 years ago, I was driving down a road that's deserted, has all these deserted businesses and factories on it. It's all overgrown. It was an October night. It was overcast. It was just that creepy vibe. And this weird idea of Nazi werewolves popped into my head. And thankfully, they're no longer in the story. They're long gone. But at the time, I sat back and sketched a Nazi werewolf. It looked kind of cool. And then I started thinking, like, who fights Nazi werewolves? And I don't know if it was influences from the underworld movies or what, but I thought about vampires. And then immediately I'm like, why couldn't Dracula be a good guy? I'm like, Dracula could be a good guy. Let's turn Dracula into the hero of the story. I kind of started doing some sketching, started doing some different versions of the Dracula character, started outlining and then writing a little bit. And I really wasn't crazy about the Nazi werewolves, got them out of the story. And then I had no idea who the bad guy was going to be. But I always loved World War II, and my grandfather was a veteran from World War II. I wanted to keep it in that time frame. And immediately I started thinking about Adolf Hitler, who obviously is one of the worst monsters, if not the worst monster that the world has ever seen in real life. And I thought, well, let's make him the bad guy. But how do we connect Dracula and Adolf Hitler? So at some point, it just popped in my head that Dracula needed an ally. I like buddy cop movies. I think they're hilarious. And I kind of wanted Dracula to have a buddy. At some point, Frankenstein's monster popped into my head because he was one of my favorites growing up, as he could be just this great ally to Dracula. And when that happened, it really shifted. It was just like an aha moment in my head, who the bad guy was, who he really was, and who his real identity was. And once that fell into place in my head, the story just flew from there. Like, I didn't have any hiccups after that. There was no writer's block. Once I knew who the bad guy was, what his real identity was, and who the heroes were, it just came from nowhere.
Well, it all came together in a really cohesive story that makes a lot of sense, and it's very original as well.
Thank you.
Piggybacking on when you said Dracula can be a good guy, it does harken back, in my mind, to the Marvel comics where monsters were essentially superheroes.
Yes.
And one of your variant covers for Monsters the Forsaken is actually the old school Marvel style monster comic cover. It says the most spine tingling team up of all.
Yeah, the League of Monsters cover. That's such an awesome cover. And I was actually approached by Pete Bell, who owns a huge comic book store in the Dayton, Ohio area called Bell Book and Comic. And he's been one of my biggest supporters since day one. And he's a huge Monsters fan. And he approached me and said, hey, I want to order X amount of copies of my own cover of your book, a variant cover of issue 1. I want you to base it on this. And will you do that? And I said, of course, because it's such a cool cover. And so that's where that cover came from.
Excellent. And if anyone out there has the trade paperback, you can see a gallery of cover art in the back. Going back to the story, absolutely. The way that you've combined classic monsters and history in a way that makes sense in this world is really impressive. But of course, I am wondering, along the way, there are a lot of subjects that are rather sensitive in World War II history. Obviously, there are things that we're still feeling the effects of around the world, and some of the most horrific genocides known to man. I mean, as you mentioned, Adolf Hitler is probably one of the worst real-life monsters the world has ever known. So when you're talking about these fictional characters and these very real historical events that are still disturbing and still affect a lot of people, what is the fine line you're walking between historical fiction and maybe veering into topics we shouldn't be talking about? What is your writing process with these special considerations in mind, and how do you keep the balance?
Well, I, having been having a grandfather that served in World War II, he talked to me a lot about that, not his personal experiences, about what the world went through at that point in time, and what all of the groups that were persecuted by Hitler in the Holocaust went through. And so it's always been something I've been very aware of. When I decided to do this story set in World War II and involve real historical figures, including Adolf Hitler, I knew that I had to tie the Holocaust in some way or the other. It's probably the most atrocious thing that's ever been done in real history. And I wanted to tie it in, give it purpose in the story, but not beat people over the head with it. I didn't want to have you see it over and over again. I wanted you to know it was there, that it's part of the story. It's an important part of the story. However, you see very little of it. And from that little of it that you see, what I wanted to do was give a whole issue, which is chapter 5 in the graphic novel, of the victims of the Holocaust rising up in a real life situation, which happened in Buchenwald in early April in 1945, when they liberated themselves along with the army. They rose up against their captors and freed themselves. I wanted to tie that into the story. I wanted to, instead of beating people over the head with seeing the atrocities that were committed, let you know they were there, but then give that whole issue basically devoted to the fictional characters combining with real life historical things and real life historical people, and basically an uprising and victory, and not make it so negative. It was an awful, awful point in history. And I just wanted to show that there was victory over it, more so than just keep putting it in front of the reader's face. That's why there's very little of it, but it's such a sensitive topic that it had to be addressed if the story was going to be told.
Well, very well said, and also very well done, in my opinion. That chapter was a great way to tie in what was a very triumphant event from a very dark time in history.
Thank you.
And on the topic of the good guys versus the bad guys, as you mentioned, Dracula is one of the good guys in this story, and Frankenstein's monster also emerges as one of the heroes as well, because each of these characters has been wronged, and they are setting out to in Dracula's case, seek vengeance over how he was wronged. And Frankenstein's monster, of course, has been wronged. So to have these monster characters as, I don't necessarily want to say just misunderstood, because there's still a lot of bloodshed and action in the process, but the moral compass that you've created for Dracula and for Frankenstein's monster, and even the Bride of the Monster, hopefully that's not too big a spoiler, but the Bride of the Monster as well, it really creates a unique dynamic in your story, in my opinion. Obviously, you are a fan of these classic monster characters yourself. Where did you sort of get the idea that you wanted to do some things this way and change some things here and there?
I've always loved the original movies. Clearly, I've watched them over and over again. But I've also loved Universal's attempt to recreate all of them. Even though the ones that failed, I still loved them. I love Dracula Untold. They tried to make him a hero. Some of the things that took place in that movie are similar to some of the things that took place in my book, but a little bit different trajectory. In the Dracula Untold, he's trying to save his family, and that's why he becomes what he becomes. In my book, it's out of pure vengeance. I wanted Dracula's story to be one of redemption. Basically, it starts off as a very good man, a family man, and then he suffers a great loss. And with that great loss, he loses his heart and part of his soul. And he is willing at that point in time to do whatever it takes to gain his vengeance. That quest for vengeance takes him on without giving too many spoilers, a very bloody path that ends up in costing him someone very dear to him. And when that happens, it shakes him to the core and makes him realize that what he had done was wrong. Vengeance is not the most important thing, that it can cost so much more to have that vengeance. He ultimately walks away from the world. He's purposeless. He becomes a shell of himself. He doesn't have anything that he wants to live for, but he also knows he can't die, because if he dies damned and cursed the way he is, he'll never see his family again. He finds a small purpose to basically rid the world of evil men. And then later on, without spoiling too much, he finds a companion, and that companion becomes someone that helps him find a purpose to try and get back to being human and to be able to not be damned anymore. When he loses that person, it's not so much a quest of vengeance that he sets off on, because he's already been there. His only quest at that point is to rid the world of evil and not let that evil that cost him that companion continue on. And that's what the heart of our story and the chase is all about over the 200 years. When I tell the story in flashback form to get to the point of World War II, one of the things I wanted to do with this story was tell it in 1945, give little bits that would make you question, like where was that from? And then kind of tell it like the first Highlander movie, if you ever saw it, where you get a little bit of right now, and then you get a flashback that tells how we got to right now. And that goes back and forth throughout the story. I wanted that to be the reader's perspective. Okay, we're in 1945. What caused that? Then give you a little bit of a flashback that shows, okay, well, this is how we got to that point. And another thing I wanted to do with the story that is different than most comic books is there's no thought bubbles. At no point in time did I want you to see what someone was thinking. It's either going to be expressed verbally, or it should be expressed through the art where you can see what's happening. But I didn't want this to be a thing of where you had a lot of introspective thought going on. I wanted it to flow in a way that you had to see what was happening, or there was verbal exchanges that told what was happening.
And the way that you have translated, quote unquote, each of the dialogue segments that take place in different countries also, in my opinion, really help tell the story through various locations and flashbacks throughout points in time. You'll have a bubble that says, translated from German or translated from Romanian, and it really helps set the scene, in my opinion. The way that you've blended the story throughout multiple different generations and locations, it ties together really well and does give readers a sense of the whole story. Like you mentioned, what led to this? Why is this character behaving this way at this time? Oh, because this thing happened before that in this place. And honestly, I think it flows really well.
Thank you. I do want to give a shout out to Benjamin Jones. He's a friend of mine who lives in Spain. He's a screenwriter, and he is my editor. I basically send him the issues when they're done. I write them, I draw them, I do all the illustrative work, and then I letter them. And when I send them to him, and he reviews it, and he will edit the dialogue and send it back. It's always got exactly what I wanted to say, but it's always better. And the funny thing was, when we first started doing this, he would send it back and he'd be like, look, I don't mean to offend you, but I think this sounds better. And I finally said, stop saying, don't worry about offending me, because I'm telling you right now, what you're doing is better. So he always captures the heart of my dialogue and what I want to express and makes it better. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Ben because he's a great guy and he has done some fantastic work on the dialogue in this book.
Absolutely. And you know what? The teamwork is what makes the dream work. So
That's
I'm
right.
always happy to hear about everyone who's involved in bringing these stories to life. And more so, not only bringing these stories to life, but continuing the stories of these familiar characters that we've had for generations, stories that are over 100 years old in most cases. So throughout the years, I know you mentioned Dracula Untold, for example, as a story that you enjoyed and how there have been several reimaginings before. But hearkening way back to the classics, do you remember what your first monster movie was?
Yeah, my first monsters movie was Frankenstein. It was one that I watched on a Saturday morning. It was a TV show that was here, that was on in the Lima, Ohio area where I grew up. Every Saturday we had classic monster movies. It was Frankenstein's Monster was my first one, and the very next week was The Wolfman.
Excellent. Those are two of the best ones to have dropping in your early experiences with monsters. And speaking of dropping in, without spoiling anything, I will say there are some more characters dropping into our story very, very soon. And if you have the graphic novel, there is a preview of the next chapter of the Monsters the Forsaken story, but we will get to that in a little bit. While we're on the topic of monsters, do you have a favorite classic monster?
So it was a three-way tie. Growing up, it was Frankenstein's Monster, the Wolfman, and the Creature from the Black Lagoon. For me, in the recent years, and when I started writing the Wolfman into the story, which I just spoiled it and gave it away, but he's coming. He's going to come. That's all there is. And if you're a fan of the classic monsters, they're all going to show up at some point, whether it's the first 12 issues or not, because there is a plan going forward. And actually, the next chapter is written. There will be multiple classic monsters appearing in this story. And right now, it's a toss-up between Frankenstein's Monster and the Wolfman.
Very good choices. And the way that those characters are blended into your story is fresh and unique and definitely shows your passion for these characters. On the topic of the Wolfman, the preview at the end of the graphic novel shows that we're going to be seeing the Wolfman in a new environment, separate from what we've seen in the first couple chapters. It appears that the Wolfman is going to be traversing the streets of London.
Yes, and specifically Whitechapel, right around the time of the Jack the Ripper murders.
So would you say that's a coincidence?
I would say there are no coincidences in life. Much like I do throughout the story, you're going to see in issue 7 some things happen in 1945, which I think are going to be fun. A really fun issue for people to read that like action and surprises. And when you conclude that issue, you're going to be like, okay, where did this come from? And that's what I want to do. Leave you with the, okay, where did this come from? And then we jump into issue 8, and we're going to go back to the time of the Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel, London. And in that issue, you're going to find how Dracula and Frankenstein's monster meet the Wolfman. And it does center around the Jack the Ripper murders. And I hope all the fans of the classic monsters and the Ripperologists enjoy what I've done in writing this issue and including Jack the Ripper into the story.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. I also read The Shadow of Frankenstein, which was a Universal Monsters novel in the 2000s, part of the official Universal Monsters brand, actually, that integrated Jack the Ripper. And then, as I mentioned in the last episode of the podcast, there was the Phantom of the Opera story in Classic Monsters Unleashed. So this character, he's sort of found a pseudo place in classic monster lore. So to have him worked into this story as well, especially from what I'm seeing in the preview there, it's going to be a really good matchup because much of Monsters the Forsaken is rooted in characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, taking down evil men, as you said, and Jack the Ripper obviously is another one of those real life monsters that is beyond horrific in his crimes. So now we've got these monsters seeking justice on another one of those real life monsters, and I think you've chosen a very good one.
Thank you very much. I wanted to tie in the main overall story arc, which I think I've done in how Dracula and Frankenstein's monster end up in Whitechapel, London, along with the Wolfman, who is there for a very different purpose. Obviously, you can see his purpose from seeing the preview of those first 7 or 8 pages that I included in the back of the graphic novel. And that was the early incarnation of those pages. I've actually redrawn a few of those pages because over the course of the last 2 years, I feel my art style has gotten more complex and better. And so I wanted to add a little bit to those because those were drawn actually about 2 years ago. So I've been working on this pretty solid over the last couple of years.
And it's so great to finally see the fruits of your labor coming together in a physical piece of media that fans can interact with, and they can help fund it through Kickstarter, which is actually how I discovered the story initially. And obviously, it stood out as a really unique interpretation the moment I saw it, and the art style is very true to the classics while still presenting something fresh with the story. I could go on about my interpretation of why the story spoke to me, but if you had to sum it up in a few sentences, what do you think makes Monsters the Forsaken unique among other familiar monster stories?
It's the basis of taking these characters and turning them into heroes. Some of them have been sympathetic characters throughout the movies, like Frankenstein's monster and even the Wolfman, because of the curse that they didn't want. Are sympathetic characters. Dracula was never really a sympathetic character in the original incarnations at all, in my opinion. However, I wanted to take these characters, turn them into heroes, and then combine them with the real life history of our planet and some of the horrible things that have been done and give them that chance to be good. And I think that that's a little different than most of the other incarnations of them out there. And I wanted people to really get a chance to take these characters that they've loved, see them in a different light, and give them something fun to read and enjoy, hopefully.
Well, I always enjoy seeing new interpretations of these familiar characters, especially when they are drawn or created in a way that evokes the original stories and the original movies that were made in the 1930s and the 1920s even. And you've definitely accomplished that in every regard. It's a fresh story with a familiar visual style. And it actually calls to mind what Universal Parks and Resorts did last year with the Bride of Frankenstein Lives attraction. The premise being that after the original Bride of Frankenstein film ended, what did the bride go on to do? And in their interpretation, the bride was distraught over the loss of the monster when the castle exploded. So she went to find a source of eternal life to bring the monster back to life. And of course, that source of eternal life is blood from Dracula and Dracula's brides. And it turned the bride into a character who had more of a spot at the forefront of the monster's lore. It brought a whole new edge to things. So I'm also wondering, as a fan of the bride and a fan of women in horror and supporting women in the monster field, are we going to see more of the Bride of the Monster in the forthcoming issues?
Oh, I think you should already know that answer from seeing the way she walked out of the confrontation that occurred. Yeah, she's going to be back. She is a force to be reckoned with. She is actually going to play a much bigger role in the second storyline. Obviously, this is a storyline that takes place at the end of World War II. At the 12th issue, this story will conclude. These characters will have completed their journey, and we're going to see the bride again before the 12th issue. But if this goes forward, which I think it will, when it starts over beyond the 12th issue with the new storyline, the bride plays a bigger part. And we actually meet some more monsters that not all of them are good. Well, not all of them are going to end up heroic. And I think that that sets up a kind of cool clash between some of people's favorites. We're going to see going forward, the bride and Frankenstein's monster obviously are going to meet at some point. And there's going to be some cool, I hope, dynamic there, the way that I've written it. Then beyond that, we're going to see a clash between our heroes and another classic monster that is going to be the big bad, basically, for the second story arc.
Excellent. I love to hear it. And if you don't mind my asking, I did happen to catch in the end of the first graphic novel, there is a reference to a character who I don't believe we've seen yet. And the character's code name in the military correspondence is Unseen. Would that be who I think that is?
That would be exactly who you would think that is.
Aha, excellent. So moving forward, we definitely do have a whole monster mash. You're not kidding.
No, I'm not. I'm a fan of these characters. I love the premise of the Dark Universe. I know a lot of creators out there that are doing things like this do. They've just misstepped as far. I don't know that they've been big missteps, but they weren't the box office smashes they wanted. So they've kind of taken a step back every time they've tried to redo this. I didn't set out to create a combined classic monster universe. I set out to tell a fun story. And then as that kind of progressed, I was able to bring in the other monsters in a way that I felt fit and was organic. And then it just became, for me, all right, this is a classic monsters shared universe in a new way that I can create. And if I feel like they don't fit, I don't add them. So I'm never going to force it. But so far, the way that I've brought most of the characters in and plan to bring most of the characters in has fit and worked for me as a fan. And if it works for me as a fan, then I feel like it'll work for most fans. And that's what I want to do. I don't ever want to force it, but I want it to be a fun way of seeing some of these characters that people love come into the story.
Absolutely. And I'd say that you did a good job as a fellow
Thank
fan
you.
and a fellow creator. I've always felt that some of the most successful creators, when they set out to create art, are the people who are fans of what they're creating.
I agree with that 100%. I think that you'll see it in other things, some of the superhero movies out there, and I love superhero movies. Obviously, I grew up loving comics, but you see when they bring in creators that don't have a passion for the actual characters and don't have a passion for the actual fandom and love of those characters, sometimes they make missteps, and those missteps don't translate well for the fans that actually are fans of those characters.
So just speaking as a fan of these characters and not necessarily from an official perspective of where you'd like to take these characters and these stories in the future of the graphic novel, you've obviously got these very interesting choices, whether it be World War II or the height of the Jack the Ripper fiasco in Whitechapel, London. What time periods would you like to see the classic monsters running amok in?
So there's going to be a couple time periods that you will see them running amok in, including, and it's going to be later on, feudal Japan. Is it not a normal choice for some of these characters? But I have come up with a way that I think it fits. And if you caught it, there is a ninja in the storyline in issue 2. And there's a reason that that character Hanaka is tied to Dracula. And that takes place in feudal Japan. And that talks about his ancestry and what occurred and why he is where he is. Also, the 50s is going to be an era I'd like to see them in, and we will see them in. And then I'd love to see a way that they could translate into the 80s, and with all of the garish fun that occurred in the 80s and the way things were with shopping malls. And, you know, if you've seen Stranger Things, which is a great show, just the neon and that time frame. And then going forward, I'd like to see him in modern times and see where that lands them.
Well, those are excellent choices, and I have to say I agree with a lot of those as well. The 80s and 90s were a particularly strong time for the Universal Monsters brand. So a lot of the early exposure I had to these characters was with the neon colors, the Stranger Things, Starcourt Mall type aesthetic. And anyone out there who makes an association in their mind between the words Universal Monsters and Doritos will know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yep.
And so we've already seen that these characters, whether or not the purists will agree, I've always found it to be fun to have these characters in those garish neon environments, because these characters were essentially first introduced to me through the holiday of Halloween. And the holiday of Halloween has become very commercialized and very bright and colorful. So it just goes hand in hand, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I do 11 by 17 prints of some of the classic monsters, not my versions of them, but the classic ones. And I do a lot of them with like a neon background. And people seem to really dig that. And I think it catches the eye when I'm at things like the Horror Hound convention, which happens a couple times a year. And some of the other, scary monster type conventions. It catches the eye of some of these people walking through that are younger, that aren't classic monster fans, that don't know anything about them, and they'll check out the print, and it gives me an opportunity to start talking to them about the classic monsters and explaining it to them. And then a lot of them will pick up the graphic novel or a couple issues of the comic and walk away with it. And what's really fun is when they come back to me, these young kids that don't know anything about these classic monsters, they're there for love of other characters, and they'll come back and they'll say, this is super cool. I love The Bride of the Frankenstein, or I love Frankenstein's monster, and I want to see more. And are you doing more? And, because usually these conventions are like 3 or 4 days, and they'll pick up something on the first or second day and come back and talk to me. And I love the opportunity to introduce these characters to a whole new generation.
That is a very meaningful opportunity, and I completely share the sentiment. There have been quite a few events that I've been to in Southern California recently where I've been extremely grateful to have been in a room at the same time as children experiencing the Universal Monsters brand. And there's
That's cool.
seeing or hearing a young person discovering these characters for the first time. And the work that you're doing now through the graphic novel and through your artwork is similar to what we saw back in the 60s with all the classic Go-Go's art. You know, there was classic monster characters right alongside bright colors that would appeal to all ages. So, hey, I mean, monster person to monster person, thanks for the good work you're doing.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I love your podcast. It's awesome. I thank you for doing this and bringing these characters to a whole new generation of people that listen to podcasts and are listening to getting their media and learning their news and things in a whole new light.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, and it means a lot. It's always a pleasure having this forum to have monster people come together to talk about the things that they love and the things that they are creating. And I also want to mention, Brian, that I always love seeing creators who take their passion for these characters or the stories that are brewing in their head, whether it's inspired by something that they grew up with or something that's wholly original that they've been dreaming of for years, or maybe a combination of both. I love seeing people take their passion and turn it into action. So kudos to you for putting these ideas down on the page with, paper, pen, brush, and bringing that art to life. You're someone who's obviously accomplishing it right now, but what would your advice be to someone who maybe they have stories in their head, maybe they're monster kids, maybe they've got something entirely different that they want to put on the page? What would your advice be to creators to be in the position that you're in now?
My advice would be is to take that chance and pursue it, because it can be scary. And I'll be honest, it was scary for me. When I started doing this, I went around to comic shops all over the area, Dayton, Cincinnati, Columbus, and most of them turned me down. They're like, we're not interested in having this in our store. You're unknown. You're not a creator that worked for Marvel or DC. So you know what? We're not interested. I found one comic book shop in Bell Book and Comic in Dayton, Ohio. He loved it. He loved the idea. I had some pages in front of him. He's like, this is awesome. You should pursue it. And he backed me on the Kickstarter, and I started feeling a little bit more confident about it. So here's the thing that I would advise you. If you have a story you want to tell, if you have art you want to do it. If you wait around for the perfect opportunity, wait around for someone to come to you, it will never happen. If you have a dream, you have to chase it, because a dream will not chase you back. The only way your dream is going to come true is if you chase it. That's the only way this happened. That's the only way I was able to get these published. That was the only way I was able to get this out to people. And now I'm getting such a positive response. I'm getting so many people that have love it and follow it, that I knew I was right in doing what I was doing and just putting myself out there. Don't be afraid of failure. Okay. That's a big thing for creators. Creators are afraid of failure. My stuff's not going to be good enough. People aren't going to like it. If you are questioning how good it is, it's probably pretty good. You should just go for it. As a creator, to any creator out there, all I can say is don't wait. Chase your dream, make it happen, and put yourself out there. The worst thing that people can tell you is no, but someone's going to say yes sooner or later. So just keep plugging away at it, keep chasing your dream, and make it happen.
Very well said. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Where can we hear more about the future of the graphic novel? Where can we help make it happen? And is there a Kickstarter launching in the next couple months?
Yes, I've been very fortunate and blessed to have my first 3 Kickstarters successfully funded that funded the first 6 issues and the graphic novel containing the first 6 issues. On July 6th, I will be launching a Kickstarter that will run through August 4th that will hopefully publish, if it's successful, issues 7 and 8. Issues 7 and 8 are some of my favorite that I've ever written. I think people will really enjoy them. Along with that, you will be able to get a new printing of the graphic novel that will contain the first 6 issues and some other really cool things. So the cool thing about this one that I'm doing that I've never done before, on July 6th, when it launches, if people go in and fund it in the first 24 hours, there's going to be some freebies that you can't get anywhere else, some original stuff that I'm going to do that you will get, even the digital only backers. So if you go in and only back the PDFs just to get that version, you're going to get some physical rewards shipped to you. So that's kind of a cool thing that I'm doing with this one. And you'll be able to get completely caught up on the story through the first 8 chapters of the story. The best way to follow me right now is through Brian Neiford Art on Instagram or Facebook, and that's spelled BrianNeifordArt. And that's at Brian Neiford Art on Instagram or Brian Neiford Art on Facebook. And then you can search Monsters of Forsaken on Kickstarter, but you won't see anything for the pre-launch until it launches on July 6th, unless you go to one of those two pages. I've got a link in the bio on my Instagram where you can go to the pre-launch page and follow it, so you'll be notified when it launches. And I regularly post things on Brian Neiford Art that will have a link that you can copy and paste and go to the pre-launch page on Kickstarter and follow it there.
So for anyone listening who is not already following the project, you can join me in doing so. I do, in fact, already follow it, so I will be aware of when it launches within that 24-hour window. You're very, very generous in providing your wares to monster people, so thank you very much for doing that. I will be very interested to see what is to come in issues 7 and 8, and, of course, beyond. From everything I've heard today, it looks like the future for Monsters the Forsaken is very bright, or should I say, very dark and gloomy, whichever you prefer.
How about dark and gloomy bright?
There we go. We just made a new adjective, and it sounds great to me.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. It was great having you on the show today. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Would love to come back sometime.
And I hope that you, dear listener, will be returning as well. But for now, keep it real, monster fans. I'm AJ Danna, and I'll see you next time on the next episode of Real Monsters Podcast. Real Monsters Podcast theme song by Alexander Taylor. Real Monsters logo and key art by Will Davenport. Real Monsters Podcast is an unofficial fan tribute to the classic monster stories of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and is not sponsored by any of the entertainment entities discussed. Any and all opinions expressed within Real Monsters Podcast are those of my own or those of my guests. Stay tuned and subscribe to Real Monsters Podcast for even more monstrous discussions.